Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Karim Talks about economics. It's episode 17, and I'm very happy to have you back with me today. Karim Talks about Economics is a podcast presented to you by me, Karim, and I talk about kind of everything, and I try to relate it as much as economics, as much as possible to economics, and I also try to give you a small insight into how economists think. This podcast is characterized by being um, three things: spontaneous, informative, and open minded. It's, it is spontaneous in the sense that um, it is less so of a presentation, but rather a discussion where I allow myself to dig deep into things that I have not thought of prior to the podcast beginning, which means that I might go to some avenues and ask some questions and talk about things that I've never talked about before. So it's really about me and you guys thinking on our toes, being on our toes constantly and thinking critically, right? And it's informative because exactly of this spontaneity that arises in this podcast, and we come to think about things, or at least I do, about things that I've not thought about before. I come to discuss things that I might not have discussed before. And for you guys, maybe you've never heard these things before. Maybe you've heard these things, but you had a different point of view about them. So now you get a different point of view. Sometimes we also have another individual with us, an interviewee, and we get that person's point of view across, and therefore we get more informed through that channel. Otherwise, we are reading from Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nation, and from that we are definitely also getting more informed. And as we read through that book, we're also trying to relate that to our everyday life and modern economics. And thirdly, it's open-minded. This podcast is very open-minded, as we are not constrained by any specific thought or any specific view, right? It's not that I am not going to ask something because I don't want to go in that direction. What I mean is that there's no specific agenda, and there's nothing that is too small to bring up or too critical to bring up. We're allowed to make mistakes in this podcast, and we're allowed to also think critically in this podcast. And therefore, we're trying to be as open minded as possible and getting people's different points of view across. Usually, the podcast is structured as the following. First, we go through the news. We usually look into the COVID-19 pandemic and the new numbers. Then we read some news. After which we have a follow up from last time, which is usually a question that we answer together that I proposed in the previous podcast. Then we have a reading session or an interview with an individual. And as we go through that, right, we write, especially when we do read, we kind of think out loud together about what things actually mean. And when we have an interviewee with us, we really try to dig deep into what they actually mean by what they say. And after which, right, during this interview and during the reading, we write some small notes. Then, right, so the fourth part is to sum up everything that we've discussed and present a new question for next time. And lastly, there is a Q&A at the end, which is going to be more prominent once this podcast has got some traction and more people follow the podcast. And these questions, of course, don't have to be at the very end, but if they are related to what we're discussing, I might take them as we go along. Yes. And yeah, I think it's already time to go into the news. And as per usual, I share my screen and and we start with the COVID-19 numbers. So as you can see, we're now at 13,340,000 cases. Not a large increase from yesterday, and the deaths are at 577,000. Also not a large increase from yesterday, which both, well, they look promising. Um, yeah, there's really not much to take from that. Um, and the number or the percentage of serious and critical ill with the corona crisis, of those that, so the active cases, well, that is 1%, and the death rate is also at 7% for the cases that have been closed. So that's a good thing. Remember, this 1% and the 7% have not changed in weeks now, which does seem that maybe, for now at least, we have a stable virus. It has not mutated. It's not becoming more dangerous. However, it might get more infectious, right? As we've heard from the US, that it might now be airborne. That younger people can now get the virus to a larger extent. However, as we can see right now from the data, it does not seem to have affected the serious and critical ill and the death rate. Then we look at the specific countries and how they are coping with it. We see that the US is back at 60,000 and above, actually 65,000, right? Which does confirm our hypothesis from yesterday that during the weekend there is less testing in the United States, and that's why there are less new cases. Mm, as we saw yesterday and the day before, it was below 50,000, right? Which is, as we expected, a little bit unrealistic. Or maybe it was 50, but it was unrealistic. The death rate has jumped to 465, which was yesterday 300, right? And we said that that's a little bit unrealistic. Miscounting or some bias in the weekend. I still think there is some bias here. With respect to the number of new cases, it's a little bit unrealistic to only have that. However, as we have discussed, there is a lag, clear lag, right? We know that the symptoms start to show after 14 days, and then after that, you might have an incubation period of a month. So, in a month, I think we're going to see some, hopefully not, but if the death rate stays constant at 7%, we will be seeing high deaths for the US. In Brazil, the number is still lower than we expect, right? With the new cases, 21,000. However, the deaths are at 770, which seems realistic. However, it is quite a lower number than they had previously. India is at 28, which is realistic. And I heard that they have actually started to close down parts of India again, which is not a good sign. However, also their death rate has increased. Now, death rate that we also look at usually in this podcast is the Mexican, because it was quite high. Um, as we can see now, it seems to be at 276, which is not a high number. Uh, I really don't know how it can fluctuate that much from one day to the other. However, it might be that there is some um, clusters of cases that just die together or something like that. I don't know. It's also a little bit unclear how they count this, right? Does every single hospital give you data every single day, or is it 10 hospitals per day and then the next day it's 10 other hospitals, or maybe 10 different sections, 10 different cities, right? I don't know. Especially in countries that are less modernized, it's maybe a little bit unclear how they do it. South Africa is at 11,000. That's also new cases, 11,554 new cases. That's also a country that we keep a close eye with, um, as it's a country that has consistently had above 10,000 new cases every single day for quite some time now. Iran seems to have some high new deaths, 200. Um, However, we did have an interviewee 3 days ago, or 2 days ago, no, 3 days ago, Hamid Reza, that said that we should maybe not trust the official numbers from Iran that much. Um, yeah, I suppose the ranking is still the same as yesterday. Nothing has really changed. Um, I hope that things get better, especially in Europe, because I personally also live in Europe. Spain is also is now increasing a little bit, 680 new cases, right? However, only one death. Canada has actually increased. It was only 200 for a lot of days, and now it's 560. Well, 565. So that's also not good to see. Now we go to the news. Let me just plug my computer in because I had an experience where the computer closed down. I also have to turn on the light here such that you can see me a little bit better. Yes. And today we're going to start with Bloomberg. Now there is some hopeful thinking about the vaccine. Uh, there are some trials that is going to start. However, as we know with vaccines, there is a lot of oh, so it's the final stage. That means that they are really hurried up because we learned from uh, a medical expert how usually the vaccine takes a very long time, right? And there's a trial on animals, first trial on humans, and then the second trial, and then you have to wait um, a couple of months or maybe years until you can actually see if there's any side effects, because vaccine can have very dangerous side effects. Um, However, here it seems like, well, they have really processed things faster than usual. Um, so yes, we also see that well, Macron, so that's France, right? That's the president of France. Well, he's saying that he's gonna put some money into the to revive the economy, which is of course a political thing, as there is also some elections soon in France. So he wants to be re-elected or to get re-elected. Now, one news that you will see concurring today is the one with the UK that has banned Huawei. They have banned the Huawei 5G antennas and they have to be removed by the year 2027. So that they say that that's because Huawei might, and therefore China, might use the data and yeah, do some they may use the data for some intelligence, which is against what the UK goes against. So they see that that's a national security threat, and therefore they are not asking, but they are really telling Huawei to remove the antennas by 2027. Yes. Now, of course, that's gonna create some political tensions. One can expect. I think it's worth maybe taking some other news before this one. Yes, again, the news with Huawei here, right? And then again, some news about the COVID-19 pandemic, that it is now increasing once again, right? And that the US might now be the epicenter. And the epicenter means that that is where the most cases occur. Um, that's of course not good to hear, and also the picture here that is viewed is not very. It's not that it's not promising, but it's not good to see this such a picture, because it really tells us how bad the situation is, right? Especially with the news from yesterday that says that they are going against Dr. Fauci, which is the top medical expert in the field. So it's a little bit difficult to know what is the American strategy, at least from outside the United States of America. Yes. And as you can see here, again, the news about this 5G and the UK and Huawei. And we also see that some cities are going back into lockdown. And that is, as I alluded to, in India, with where Bangalore it has to go back into lockdown. So that's in India. And also, so we know that parts of Florida and Texas had to go into lockdown again in the United States of America. And also, people have to wear masks. It's obligatory now, or mandatory now in some places, at least when you go into closed areas. Um, that is something that you have to do. Yes. And now to this news from Al Jazeera. So it's again, they are working with the news that the White House is going against Fauci. Um, and now they are really discussing the case with Africa. They are also mentioning Africa. Why? Well, because we know that if COVID happens in Africa, we kind of have a problem because there is not a strong healthcare, and the people that get ill or seriously and critically ill down there will most likely die. Why? Because a lack of hospitalization, a lack of respirators, and a lack of the equipment and the safety. And therefore, maybe also the medical staff is more at risk in those countries than in other countries, um, right? And now we see that that 600,000 or more cases in Africa has have COVID, or have been confirmed to have COVID, and that is of course, or a huge bunch of that is of course South Africa and Egypt, right? Two countries with the most cases are those two countries. So maybe it's not all over Africa, but at least in those countries. Now, of course, those two countries are also the two. Well, Nigeria is also a rich country, but those two countries are, however, two of the largest economies in Africa, and therefore they might also be the two countries that can most um, they are the countries that can most test for it. So one could expect that in places where you cannot test for COVID, that it might be worse, right? So the reality of the case might be worse than what we actually know it. And thirdly, we also know these countries for being dictatorships and being people that want to, well, maybe people that don't entirely have a control over their country, and they don't have a clear healthcare system where they can actually control for these things. So I suppose if the official numbers are 600,000, then the true number is at least double that. Okay. And I think that's an early end to our news session, at least compared to yesterday, which I actually think is a good thing because it was very long yesterday. And now it's time to the second part of the second part of the podcast, which is a follow up from last time. So yesterday we talked about um, that governments should try to stop people. Or we read from Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, and in that he described that governments should well, the government wanted to try to limit people's spending as they could save more and then invest that, right? And then we compared that to today. Now we want people to spend more, not to save, right? That's seen as kind of a problem. Um, and he talked about durable goods and how that might increase uh, the wealth of the nation, and but he was also critical of that and compared it um, to non-durable goods, and he said that durable goods, to buy those jewelry for instance, that's a little bit selfish. However, buying non-durable goods, so maybe having a party as a big celebration, is altruistic, but it does not increase and does not benefit the society as a whole, and therefore there is a trade-off. Do you want to increase let's call it the wealth of the country with durable goods and be selfish, or do you want to not increase and be altruistic, right? And one thing that we also noticed is that Adam Smith criticized the government, and he criticizes it very publicly in the book, which is quite fascinating because I personally did not expect that from him. And then we came up with this question that we have to answer today: how should governments reinvest money into the public through okay, into the public through durable goods, right? So firstly, how should governments reinvest money into the public? So firstly, is it maybe it's worth asking, firstly, should governments reinvest money into the public, right? Firstly, should they? And what does it mean that they are reinvesting money into the public? Because the government really doesn't have any money, right? Well, it can get taxes, right? It can collect taxes. It can also have some resources that it sells, land maybe. So that is kind of the money that we're talking about. Either it's resources that it's selling, or it's taxes that it is collecting. So that's where the money of the government comes. And then the question is, should it reinvest it into the public? Well, the question is, what does it mean to reinvest? When I wrote reinvest, I really thought about taxes. Um, I didn't think about the resources because you cannot reinvent the land, right? The revenue that comes from land, because that's some new money that is created. To selling a forest, for instance, right? If you get the money from that, should you put that into the public again? Well, I suppose firstly, they there is um, there should be a discussion about the extent of government. So there is some basic goods that the government has to offer, and basic goods and services. So I think the first thing is that those things should be covered. The things that are unproductive, that go into the unproductive labor, right? What does that mean? Well, it, more specifically, it means that maybe the money that the government gets, that should be not invested into the public, but should be used to as wages. Firstly, right? So that's the first thing. Should be spent as wages. So maybe people working in the military, in the court system, in the police, and things like that. Let's then assume that there's some more money. Then the question really becomes, should it keep that money for the future or should it put it back into the system? Well, it's a really good question. Should the government run a balanced budget or should it have some money that it can use at other points in time? Well, that of course depends on the strategy that the government has. If the government wants to build a hospital, well, here in Denmark, for instance, we have something called super hospitals. Those are very large hospitals. Well, maybe by selling one forest, you cannot build this super hospital. You might need to sell five. And therefore, you're saving, right? You have to save the price of five of these forests. Great. So it should not reinvest the money, first of all, right? It should really think about, well, what does it want to create and then strategize. Fine. But if we consider the question on a larger scale, should we build this? So, yes, the balanced budget, I suppose not, because it depends on the strategy that the government should have, right? Okay, good. So, should the government build this super hospital or should it maybe well, the thing is, or should it let the private do it? Well, the thing is, if it sells these, it receives the money. So should it not use this money, or should it just give it equally out to everyone? As this is a national product, and then everyone can use it as they please, right? Or after, of course, having paid off all the unproductive laborers and the services, right? The policemen and the military. So it has some money that is the profit. Should that as well? That depends on how you want to run the government, I suppose. But yeah, so you have a small profit. In businesses, usually that goes to the auctioneers or to investments. So I suppose some of it should go to investments. And some of it, well, the question is, how do you give it back to the people? Would you rather give them money or do you want to invest in the society? And I suppose that is really what the question was about, right? Let's say that the government gives the money out, um, that it profits, right, from selling these forests. Okay, now people have more money. Now they can either spend that on more goods, or they could save it and lend it to businesses. Okay, and the question becomes, would it have been better if the government would have invested that into durable goods? What is a durable good? And of course, here there is an implicit assumption that it should not be spending the money into non-durable goods, which is, for instance, making a large party for the people. That does not make sense, as that's just a waste of money. And as we discussed and alluded to yesterday, maybe make that as a marketing strategy for the private. Don't use the public's money on that, because it's a waste. It's a waste of money, right? It does not add anything. However, if you give it to painters, maybe, right, and you buy paintings, that is, as we discussed, maybe a durable good. So should the government buy paintings instead? Well, firstly, that would mean that some people that are unproductive, the painters, now receive a wage. Uh, of course, now that they receive a wage, they now go and buy products from the productive, or maybe they save and also lend it to yeah. So that of course increases. It's basically hiring more people, right? It's basically what is the question is basically, how should the government consume, right? And then I tried to relate it to yesterday's discussion about durable goods and non-durable goods. And I really think it should use it on durable goods and not the non-durable goods. And the durable goods are these paintings. So I personally am okay, and it would be nice to get some other people's view on this, but I'm okay with it. Well, paintings, you give money out to people, that's a good thing. There's a wage there, and there are profit for those. However, not give them more than you would give to doctors and things like that, because it should be seen as you kind of supporting these people, right? It's not, you don't need to make them millionaires just because they are creating art. Um, as you could have invested that into productive hands rather than non-productive hands, right? You could invested that in firms. Uh, yeah. And of course, you should never give money without expecting something in return if you're giving it to the productive hands, because otherwise it's non-productive, right? Then it's just consumption. It's not investing anymore. So of course, if the government has the opportunity to invest, definitely do that. If it doesn't, then buy durable goods. I think that's. However, the question is, how should the government reinvest money? Well, that is by buying non-durable goods. What kind of durable goods? Well, durable goods that well, is a castle a durable good? What if the government goes in and buys a private library, a library that is for sale? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's a good thing, I think. Well, to run a library, that will also cost you a lot of money. Uh, well, buying the books is something else, though, right? That is a durable good. So maybe if you have a lot of money, the government has a large profit and it doesn't know what to do with that profits, and they have to use the profits, buy books, for instance, buy paintings, buy things that are existing. Don't do large parades. Um, don't do things that don't make sense. That is non-durable goods. Okay, so invest when they can, otherwise durable goods. Now, is that better than just giving the money to the population? Well, if you just give money to the population and you're not giving it into people that can be productive, right? Then you're just increasing the money that all the people have. You're increasing the money in circulation, maybe, if they are not saving that money, right? And just everyone gets richer. Um, And if the force that you've sold is not producing any new value, then what's what are you doing, really? That doesn't really make sense. Okay, so I think that's it from last time, and now it's time to the third section of the podcast, which is reading. And yeah, we're reading in an inquiry into the case of into the nature and cause of the wealth of nation by Adam Smith, published in the year 1776, and we're currently in the second book. Yes, currently in the second book, title of the nature, accumulation, and employment of stock, and we're currently at chapter 4 of stock lent at interest. Of stock lent at interest. So we're lending out some stock um, and receiving some interest. So let's read and let's see what all of this is about. Just give me a second. I need to check something. Yes. Okay. Great. Okay. And we're on page 186. Yep. Okay. The stock which is lent at interest is always considered as a capital by the lender. He expects that in due time it is restored to him, and that in the meantime the borrower is to pay him a certain annual rent for the cause of it, for the use of it. The borrower may use it either as a capital or as a stock reserved for immediate consumption. If he uses it as a capital, he employs it in the maintenance of productive laborers who reproduce the value with a profit. He can in this case both restore the capital and pay the interest without alienating, alienating or encroaching upon any other source of revenue. If he uses it as a stock reserve for immediate consumption, he acts the part of a prodigal and dissipates in the maintenance of the idle what was destined for the support of the industrious. He can, in this case, neither restore the capital nor pay the interest without either alienating or encroaching upon some other resource of revenue, such as the property of the rent of land. Such as the property or the lent of land. The stock which is lent at interest is no doubt occasionally employed in both these ways, but in the former much more frequently than in the later. The man who borrows in order to spend will soon be ruined, and he who lends to him will generally have occasion to repent of his folly. To borrow or to lend for such a purpose, therefore, is in all cases where gross uh, usury is out of question, contrary to the interest of both parties, and though it no doubt happens sometimes, the people do both the one and the other. Yet from the regard that all men have for their own interest, we may be assured that it cannot happen so very frequent as we are sometimes apt, apt to imagine. As any rich man of common prudence, to which of the two sorts of people he has lent the greater part of his stock, to those who he thinks will employ it profitably, or to those who will spend it idly, and he will laugh at you for proposing the question. Even among borrowers, therefore, not the people in the world most famous for frugality, the number of the frugal and industrious surpasses considerably that of the prodigal and the idle. So that means that you only you should only borrow money to invest uh, to frugal individuals, to frugal and industrious individuals. And that you should never borrow money just to increase consumption, because how will you pay it back is the good question, right? That's the question that is arised here. And the joke that he makes is that a businessman that has a lot of capital knows what kind of person that he's lending the people lending to, right? It's not that he's just giving his money out to anyone. He's trying to find these people that are frugal and industrious, and where he can kind of guarantee a return on the money that he's lent out. Otherwise, this businessman is foolish. The only people to whom stock is commonly lent without their being expected to make any very profitable use of it are countrymen, country gentlemen, who borrow upon mortgage. Even they scarce ever borrow merely to spend. What they borrow, one may say, is commonly spent before they borrow it. They have generally consumed so great a quantity of good advanced to them upon credit by shopkeepers and tradesmen that they find it necessary to borrow at interest in order to pay the debt. The capital borrowed replaces the capital of those shopkeepers and tradesmen which the country gentlemen could not have replaced from the rents of their estates. It is not properly borrowed in order to be spent, but in order to replace a capital which had been spent before. Almost all loans at interest are made in money, either of paper or of gold and silver. But what the borrower really wants and what the lender readily supplies him with is not the money, but the money's worth, or the goods which it can purchase. If he wants it as as a stock for immediate consumption, it is those goods only which he can place in the stock. If he wants it as a capital for employing industry, it is from those goods only that the industrious can be furnished with the tools, materials, and maintenance necessary for carrying on their work. By means of the loan, the lender, as it were, assigns to the borrower his right to a certain portion of the annual produce of the land and the laborer of the country to be employed as the borrower pleases. The quantity of stock, therefore, or, as it is commonly expressed, of money which can be lent at interest in any country, is not regulated by the value of the money, whether paper or coin, which serves as its instrument of the different loans made in the country, but by the value of the part of the annual produce which, as soon as it comes either from the ground or from the hands of productive laborers, is destined not only for replacing a capital, but such a capital as the owner does not care to be at the trouble of employing himself. Okay, so that's an interesting part of the book, uh, where Adam really talks about what does it mean that I lend you money? Does it mean that I want my money back at some time, or does it mean that I want the value of my money back? Right? So lenders want the value of their capital back, right? It's because if you're lending the money out, makes sense, right? If you're lending the money out, you want to receive some money back. But why is it that you want to receive some money back? It's because you want to be able, well, at the very depth of things, right? The very heart of things, you want to be able to consume that money at a future period in time. Now, knowing that your money becomes less worth, you invest it, such as you maybe can at least keep a small part of that consumption um consumption power in the future period. However, you can also think of it as I'm lending you that, and I expect to get this portion of what you're producing in the future. I want 10% of what you're producing, right? I'm giving you 10 million today, and I want 10% of what you're producing in the future. It's also a way of looking at it, right? So you want the value of the productive, or of what the capital is going to be used for. A value of this productive hand, or the land that you're giving, or that you where you are employing this capital in, because one should see capital as what is it that we call it, a productive factor, production factor, factor of productivity, or something like that, right? So it's something that can produce something. You employ the capital as you employ the labor, because and as you also employ the land, or as you employ the machinery, or as you employ the technology. All of these things are things you employ to produce something, a good that is consumable at the very end, or non-consumable, durable maybe, right? Okay. It is distinct not only from the landed, but from the trading and manufacturing interests, as in these last hmm, as in these last the owners themselves employ their own capital. Even in the moneyed interest, however, the money is, as it were, but the deed of assignment, which conveys from one hand to another those capital which the owners do not care to employ themselves. So basically, what he's saying here is that I want the value of what this capital can produce had I invested it myself, right? So you just do it for me, and then I get some profit out of it. Okay, so let's carry on. Those capitals may be greater in almost all proportions than the amount of money which serves as the instrument of their conveyance. Um, the same pieces of money success successively serving for many different loans as well as for many different purchases. A, for example, lends to W £1,000, with which W immediately purchases of B £1,000 worth of goods. B, having no occasion for the money himself, lends the identical pieces to X, with which X immediately purchases of C another £1,000 worth of goods. C, in the same manner and for the same reason, lends the money to Y, who again um, purchases goods with them of D. In this manner, the same pieces, either of coin and paper, may in the course of a very few days serve as the instrument of three different loaners and of three different purchases, each of which is in the value equal to the whole amount of those pieces. What the three moneyed men A, B, and C assigned to the three borrowers W, X, and Y is the power of making those purchases. Okay. In this power, in this, in yes, that is true. In this power consists both the value and the use of the loans. The stock lent by the three moneyed men is equal to the value of the goods which can be purchased with it, and is three times greater than that of the money with, with which the purchases are made. Those loans, however, may be all perfectly well secured, the goods purchased by the different debtors being so employed as in due time to bring back with a profit an equal value either of coin or of paper, and as the same pieces of money can thus serve as the instrument of different loans to three or for the same reason to 30 times their value. So they may likewise successfully serve as the instrument of repayment. A capital lent at interest may in this manner be considered as an assignment from the lender to the borrower of a certain considerable portion of the annual produce upon condition that the borrower in return shall during the continuation of the loan annually assign to the lender a small portion called the interest, and at the end of it a portion equally considerable with that which had originally been assigned to him called the repayment. Though money, either coin or paper, serves generally as the deed of assignment both to the smaller and to the more considerable portion, it is itself altogether different from what is assigned by it. The proportion as that share of the annual produce which as soon as it comes either from the ground or from the hands of the productive laborers is destined for replacing a capital increases in any country, what is called the moneyed interest naturally increases with it. The increase of those particular capital from which the owners wish to derive a revenue without being at the trouble of employing them themselves. Accompanies uh, naturally accompanies the general increase of capital, or in other words, the stock increases, the quantity of stock to be lent at interest growing gradually greater and greater. As the quantity of stock to be lent at interest increases, the interest or the price which must be paid for the use of that stock necessarily diminishes, not only general causes hmm, from those general causes which make the market price of things commonly diminish as their quantity increases, but from other causes which are particular or peculiar to this particular case. Okay. I have to be honest. Kind of understand what this is talking about, but I'm not. It's talking about the idea that money can be spent by different people. The same amount of money can go around and around in the economy. Um, the idea of A, B, and C, and the X, W, and W, X, and Y, sorry. It's just the circulation of money, right? Um, and then he goes on and says, which I think is the same thing as the thing he started with, right? That you're just kind of asking a small proportion. So the lender is asking a small proportion from the borrower, uh, in what this money is going to be employed in. Let's see what he wants to tell us. Particular case, yes. As capitals increase in any country, the profits which can be made by employing them necessarily diminishes. Understandable. It becomes gradually more and more difficult to find within the country a profitable method of employing any new capital. There arises, in consequence, a competition between different capitals, the owner of one endeavoring to get possession of that employment which is occupied by another. But upon most occasions, he can hope to justle that other out of this employment by no other means but by dealing upon more reasonable terms. He must not only sell what he deals in somewhat cheaper, but in order to get it to sell, he must sometimes too buy it dearer. The demand for productive labor by the increase of the funds which are destined for maintaining it grows every day greater and greater. Laborers easily find employment, but the owners of capital find it difficult to get laborers to employ. Their competition raises the wage of labor and sinks the profits of stock. But when the profits which can be made by the use of capital are in this manner diminished, as it were at both ends, the price which can be paid for the use of it, that is, the rate of interest, must necessarily be diminished with them. So that's an interesting case that is very which is really what's happening today, right? The interest rates have decreased um, quite dramatically, and it does so because we don't know where to put the money, where to invest it, where to get the new capital, right? So now the capital owners are really in aggressive competition with one another, because now you have a capital but you don't know what to produce, and now you're producing something but it's really not well, it is paying, right? Because you're buying the consumption in the future or the produce in the future. However, what are you going to buy it for? And today apparently some people are willing to give you money so you can take money from them, because money doesn't mean anything to them anymore. It's not that money doesn't mean anything to them right now, but it's really difficult to find um, a place where money can develop very fast. The value of the produce can develop very fast. And I suppose that's why um, something like Tesla has increased very much, because investors see that as an opportunity where their money can increase very, very largely. Uh, if not today, maybe 20 years, or they believe that this is a company that will exist forever, and therefore it's worth very much today. Um, and what he's basically saying is that as countries grow richer, it becomes more difficult As countries grow richer, it becomes, and I'm going to say this before writing it down, as countries grow richer, it becomes difficult for people that hold capital to employ capital. So employing capital is difficult in, or is more difficult in rich economies, right? So that's one idea, and then capital can compete with each other. Yes. Now comes some names. Let's see. Mr. Locke, Mr. Lowe, and Mr. Montesquieu, as well as many other writers, seem to have imagined that the increase of the quantity of gold and silver in consequence of the discovery of the Spanish West Indies was the real cause of the lowering of the rate of interest through the greater part of Europe. Those metals, they say, having become of less value themselves, the use of a particular portion of them necessarily becomes of less value too, and consequently the price which could be paid for it. This notion, which at first sight seems so plausible, have been so fully exposed by Mr. Hume that it is perhaps unnecessary to say anything more about it. The following very short and plain argument, however, may serve to distinctly, explain more distinctly the fallacy which seems to have misled those gentlemen. Okay, I'm just checking my phone very quickly to see if there's something important because I got a lot of notifications suddenly. Um, got something from the U.S. The U.S. will resent a new policy requiring foreign students to leave the country if their schools switch to online only classes. The Dow Industrials rallied about 550 points, marking the biggest one-day gain for the index in 2 weeks. The Trump administration, yeah, that's again that thing with students. Again, the thing with students. Yep. So yeah, there's some news about what will happen to students in the U.S., and I think that's just a political game. As as we discussed with Dr. Bassem, who've been to the United States for multiple times, most of the a lot of students in the U.S. are Chinese, so maybe that's a move, right? They know that. Uh, and also students mostly, in order to support themselves in the US, they might have some jobs, and that will make it more difficult for the Americans to get jobs, and therefore he wants to get rid of them, and therefore the American students will be able to, and the lower class will be able to get more jobs. Yeah. However, let's go back. So there's something with the value of money not being there anymore because there's a lot of gold and silver. It's quite interesting to today, right? Because we're also saying that there's a lot of money out there. Let's see what this means. Before the discovery of the Spanish West Indies, and we're at page 188 of the Wealth of Nations. Before the discovery of the Spanish West Indies, 10% seemed to have been the common rate of interest through the great part of Europe. It has since that time in different countries sunk to 6, 5, 4, and 3%. It's today at 0, at 1%, or even lower. Let us suppose that in every particular country the value of the silver has sunk precisely in the same portion as the rate of interest, and that in those countries, for example, where interests have been reduced from 10 to 5%, the same quantity of silver can now purchase just half the quantity of goods which it could have purchased before. This supposition will not, I believe, be found anywhere agreeable to be true, but it is the most favorable to the opinion which we are going to examine. And even upon this supposition, it is utterly impossible that the lowering of the value of silver could have the smallest tendency to lower the rate of interest. If a hundred if £100 are in those countries now of no more value than 50 pounds, where then 10 must now be of no more value than 5 were then. However, where the causes where the causes which lowered the value of the capital, the same must necessarily have lowered that of the interest, and exactly in the same proportion. The proportion between the value of the capital and that of the interest must have remained the same, though the rate had never been altered. By altering the rate, on the contrary, the proportion between those two values is necessarily altered. If £100 now are worth no more than £50 then, £5 now can be worth no more than £2 and 10 sterlings. I think the S stands for sterlings. Uh, were then. Okay. By conducting the rate of interest, by reducing the rate of interest, therefore, from 10 to 5%, we give the use of the capital, which is supposed to be equal to one half of its former value, and interest, which is equal to one fourth only of the value of the former interest. Okay? And increase in the quantity of silver, while that of the commodity. I'm very sorry. An increase in the quantity of silver, which that of the commodities circulating by means of it remains the same, could have no other effect than to diminish the value of that metal. The nominal value of all sorts of goods would be greater, but their real value would be precisely the same as before. They would be examined, excuse me, they would be exchanged for a greater number of pieces of silver, but the quantity of labor which they could command, the number of people whom they could maintain and employ, which would be precisely the same. The capital of the country would be the same, though a greater number of pieces might be required for conveying any equal portion of it from one hand to another. The, the deeds of assignment, like the conveyances of verbose attorney, would be more cumbersome, but the thing assigned would be precisely the same as before, and could produce only the same effect. The funds for maintaining productive labor being the same, the demand for it would be the same. Its its price or wage, therefore, though nominally greater, would really be the same. They would be paid in greater number of pieces of silver, but they would purchase only the same quantity of goods. He's really repeating himself to put the point in. Okay, the profits of stock would be the same, both nominally and really. Okay, the wages of labor are commonly computed by the quantity of silver which is paid to the laborer. When that is increased, therefore, his wage appears to be increased, though they may sometimes be no greater than before. But the profits of stock are not computed by the number of pieces of silver with which they are paid, but by the proportion which those pieces bear to the whole capital employed. Thus, in a particular country, 5 shillings a week are said to be the common wages of labor, and 10% the common profits of stock, but the whole capital of the country being the same as before, the competition between the different capitals of individuals into which it was divided would likewise be the same. They would all trade with the same advantages and disadvantages. The common proportion between capital and profit, therefore, would be the same, and consequently, the common interest of money, what can commonly be given for the use of money, being necessarily regulated by what can commonly be made by the use of it. Any increase in the quantity of commodities annually circulated within the country, while that of the money which circulates with them remain the same, would, on the contrary, produce many other important effects beside that of raising the value of money. The capital of the country, though it may nominally be the same, would really be augmented. It might continue to be expressed by the same quantity of money, but it would commonly command a greater quantity of labor. The quantity of productive labor which it could maintain and employ would be increased, and consequently the demand for the labor its and yeah, and consequently the demand for that labor. Its wages would naturally rise with the demand, and yet might appear to sink. They might be paid with a smaller quantity of money, but the smaller quantity might purchase a greater quantity of goods than a greater had done before. The profits of stock would be diminished both really and in appearance. The whole capital of the country being augmented, the competition between the different capitals of which it was composed would naturally be augmented along with it. The owners of those particular capitals would be obliged to content themselves with a smaller proportion of the produce of labor which their respective capitals employed. The interest of money keeping pace always with the profits of stock might in this manner be greatly diminished, though the value of money or the quantity of goods with which any particular sum could purchase was greatly augmented. In some countries, in some countries, the interest of money has been prohibited by law. Okay, let's stop here. Let's not stop infinitely, but I mean let's stop here for a small break. I'm gonna give you a minute, and then I'm gonna come back and kind of give you a summary of how I understand this passage. Yes, so I'm back. Um, and I think what Adam Smith is saying in this passage, right? What we've just read. Oh, I have to tell you, I bought some great strawberries today. Very cheap, very cheap, right? It's the idea. It's the main idea of this passage. We have more money, however, strawberries are cheaper. How does this come? That's exactly what we're talking about, right? That's why the interest rate has gone down, both in the time that he's writing this book and also in the time where, well, in the time that we're living in at the moment, right? I thought that was funny to bring up the strawberries, but however, it's a good example of and a good explanation of what we're actually reading about. So the idea is that it's not just that there's more money in the economy, it's the fact that money can buy more. Well, it's not that specifically it can buy more, but the real value of money has increased. There's been some productivity that has led that we can buy more, and it's not that goods are going to become more expensive, and with money, the quantity of money increasing, the inflation is just going to increase, right? It's not how it works, at least not in the passage that he is explaining, and as we can see in our normal day life. It's not that we've suddenly printed out a huge amount of money, and therefore everyone is just getting money, and no one is getting. Oh, excuse me. And the commodities are getting more expensive in the same proportion. That's not what is happening. The reason why the interest rate in this example has decreased is that capital has become more available. And that is exactly what he also said in the past passages, that the capital is competing with one another. Those who own the capital are now competing with one another to get to get, well, first of all, to be able to employ their capital, and secondly, to be able to get an interest on that capital, right? Yeah. So so now we've actually reached a proportion in our lives, or a part in our life, where it's actually pretty difficult for the for the capitals, the capitalistic people, to be able to actually employ their capital because it's so widely available. So that's that. Okay, let's continue. Where are we? Any increase in the quantity of commodity annually circulates within the yes. In some countries, okay, and that's this part. In some countries, the interest of money has been prohibited by law. That's basically the Islamic countries. But as something, well, at least that's interesting to see what he's going to say about that. Okay, but as something can everywhere be made by the but as something can be everywhere be hmm, yeah, that's a little bit weird for today's English to start a sentence like that, and that's why I'm, yeah, rereading the sentence again. But as something can be everywhere be used by hmm, be made by the use of money, something ought everywhere to be paid for the use of it. This regulation, instead of preventing, has been found from experience to increase the evil of usury. I don't know what that means. I need to check that. Boom, 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 boom. The action or practice of lending money at unnecessarily high rates of interest. What? Okay. Usury. The debtor being obliged to pay not only for the use of the money, but for the risk which the which his creditor runs by accepting a compensation for the use. He is obliged, if one may say so, to insure his creditor from the penalties of usury. In countries where interest is permitted, the law, in order to prevent the extortion of usury, generally fixes the highest rate which can be taken without incurring a penalty. This rate ought always to be somewhat above the lowest market price, or the price which is commonly paid for the use of money by those who can give the most undoubted security. If this legal rate should be fixed below the lowest market rate, the effects of this fixation must be nearly the same as those of a total prohibition of interest. The creditor will not lend his money for less than the use of it is worth, and the debtor must pay him for the risk which he runs by accepting the full value of that use. If it is fixed precisely at the lowest market price, it ruins the honest people who respect the laws of their country, the credit of all those who cannot give the very best security, and obliges those to have recourse to exorbitant usurers. Okay, that was a difficult sentence. However, it's not that very important. In a country such as Great Britain, where money is lent to government at 3% and to a private upon good security at 4 or 4.5%, the present legal rate, 5%, is perhaps as proper as any. The legal rent, it is to be observed, though it ought to be somewhat above, ought not to be much above the lowest market rate. If the legal rate, and I'm going to write here as a note, legal rate, uh, legal um, rate of interest, rate of interest in Great Britain, for example, was fixed so high as 8 or 10%, the greater part of the money which was to be lent would be lent to prodigals and projects who alone would be willing to give this high interest. Sober people who will give for the use of money no more than a part of what they are likely to make by the use of it would not venture into the competition. A great part of the capital of the country would thus be kept out of the hands which were most likely to make a profitable and advantageous use of it, and thrown into those which were more likely to waste and destroy it. Where the legal rate of interest, on the contrary, is fixed but a very little above the lowest market rate, sober people are universally preferred as borrowers to prodigals and projectors. The person who lends money gets nearly as much interest from the former as he dares to take from the latter, and this money is much safer in the hands of the one set of people than in those of the other. A great part of the capital of the country is thus thrown into the hands in which it is most likely to be employed with advantage. No law can reduce the common rate of interest below the lowest ordinary market rate. At the time when that law is made, notwithstanding the edict of 1766, by which the French king attempted to reduce the rate of interest from 5 to 4%, money continued to be lent in France at 5%, the law, the law being evaded in several different ways. The ordinary market price of land, it is to be observed, depends everywhere upon the ordinary market rate of interest. The person who has a capital from which he wishes to derive a revenue without taking the trouble to employ it himself deliberates whether he should buy land with it or lend it out at interest. The superior security of land, together with some other advantages which almost everywhere attend upon this species of property, will generally dispose him to content himself with a smaller revenue from land than what he might have have by lending out his money at interest. These advantages are sufficiently to compensate a certain difference of revenue, but they will compensate a certain difference only, and if the rent of land should fall short of the interest of money by a greater difference, nobody should buy land, which would soon reduce the ordinary price. On the contrary, if the advantages should much more than compensate the difference, everybody would buy land. So land versus lending. So buying land versus lending capital. Buy land which would again soon raise the ordinary price. When the interest was at 10%, land was commonly sold for 10 or 12 years purchase. As interest sunk to 6, 5 or 4%, the price of land rose to 25 and 20 and 30 years purchase. The market rate of interest is higher in France than in England, and the common price of land is lower. In England, it commonly sells at 30 and in France 20 years purchase. But there's a trade-off. I was actually a little bit unaware of this one. So now I think that's the end of reading for today, as we've reached a new chapter of that different employments of capitals, which is going to be very, very, very much interesting, I suppose. I didn't know that you could employ capital in different ways. Well, you've actually just told us that you can employ it in buying land, or you can lend it out as capital, i.e. for equity, right? You can buy equity in firms, which is basically today's version of the stock market, I suppose. Or it is basically the stock market, okay? So let's see. Today we started out, well, we read in Adam Smith, and we started out by reading a little bit about um, borrowing money to a frugal and industrious individual. So those are the people that you should give your money to. You should not give it to people that would waste it, to the idle persons and prodigal people. And lastly, also to those that no, that's a different discussion. Let me not go into that yet. And the idea is that lenders want the value of their capital back. They don't necessarily want the capital itself back, That does not make any sense, right? They want the value of the capital back, and that was related that they want the same consumable power with some profit, right? They are lending this capital as they want a part of the business or the part of the produce of the business. And then we went on to read about how it can be difficult to employ capital in rich countries, as rich countries usually have a higher number of capital. Well, not a higher number, but a higher quantity of capital. And okay, let's think of this, right? You have individuals that are richer. Now, if these people are really rich, not nominally rich, right? So Zimbabwe was nominally rich, not real rich. So you've covered all your basic goods. Now you have some money among your hands, right? And you want to invest that. Okay, good. The fact that you have money to invest means that you have capital. Now, that's a rich country. Now, if that country has a lot of those people with the same characteristics, there's a lot of money to be lent out. Now, these lenders, let's say that there are only five people that say we want to borrow the money. Well, suddenly all of these people that are lending out the money will compete against each other in order to be able to save or to profit uh, on lending this money, right? So the idea is that capital can actually compete with one another, even though the capital in the entire country increases, right? So it's not so when capital increases, it's not that everything becomes more expensive, but maybe you also become richer, and it also becomes more difficult for capital to compete. It becomes more difficult to lend capital out because less people want the money, and it's also such that you will have to compete with other people that have capital and also want to lend it out. Okay. So yeah, difficult to employ. And what does that mean, right? So difficult to employ, more costly, and you have to compensate by taking a small interest, right? So maybe when only two people, right? You have five that want to borrow money, and only two that can actually give you money. The capitalist, you only have two capitalists in the society. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that these two will control the society, right? They will control it because they are the ones that can give it out. Therefore, they would ask for a high interest rate. So they have a larger, and I see this again as a labor market, right? Um, where they will, where the lender has to find the borrower, and with that, they it becomes more expensive. Excuse me. Well, yes, it does become more expensive for the borrower to borrow money, as he would be asked to give a high interest rate because now he's competing with the other borrowers, right? However, the different case happens if you still have these five that want to borrow the money, but you have 50 that are willing to give you money, right? Now, these that lends out the money will ask a lower interest rate across the board, right? Until the one that is willing to go the lowest will be the one, at least in a perfect competitive market, is the one that will be lending the money out and therefore uh, earning a profit on his money. Okay, great. Then we talked about the legal rate of interest, and that is when he said, well, firstly, let's think of a country with no interest rate. What would then happen? Where it's prohibited to take interest rate. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that if I borrow you my money, I want to be pretty much sure that I'm getting my money back, or maybe I'm not lending you my money at all. And if that's the case, I'm going to take a part of your business. I'm not going to take a right. I want a guarantee that I can actually get my money. So you take a part of the business plus the money back. Um, so that's the way that it would be. However, less people would be in line in willing to indulge in such a system, and therefore having a flexible interest rate. Well, I don't know if flexible is the right word, but an interest rate that can fluctuate in the economy is good. And then we discussed, well, what should this interest rate be at? Well, you have an interest rate for which the government lends money at. Well, and then of course, because you're more secure to get the money back from the government than it is to get it from the private sector, you're willing to well, you have, it's not that you're willing to, but you have, because there is a high risk, you have to get a higher interest rate when lending to the private sector. Okay, great. So now you're lending out to the private sector maybe at 4% or 4.5%. Well, that can fluctuate, right? Because there's a lower bound, maybe good businesses, secure investments, that's 4%, something that's more risky, and something that will take years. Maybe the first time that you lend out to Apple and here I'm talking about the company and Amazon, well, that was a risky business because it was quite unknown. So maybe that was at 7-8%, right? Now, if you put the legal, the legal interest rate at well, I think what he was talking about is the minimum legal rate of interest. So if you put that at maybe 4%, well, then at that point, and you were not allowed to earn more than 4% as a lender, well, at that point, you would never lend out to Microsoft, to Apple, excuse me, and Amazon in this example. And what does that mean? Well, you would never have these innovative products. So that's not what you want. But you also don't want it to be at 7%, right? Such that the secure projects will never be accomplished. So there is a trade-off here, and he says that it is perfect to have it just somewhere in the middle, so maybe 5%, if in this imaginary example that I've proposed. And then he ended this chapter with something that I imagine we'll be discussing tomorrow, is maybe if you're not going to if these capitalists are not going to lend their money out, well, what's the alternative? And in this case, it's buying land, right? Because land kind of holds its value, uh, because you can employ land, right? You can employ it for dwellings, and you can employ it for machinery, and you can employ it for agriculture. So that's an alternative. And then he says those two go hand in hand. If it becomes more easy to lend out capital, meaning that the interest rate is maybe at 10%, well, at that time it's cheaper to buy land. And why is it so? Well, because most of the capital is going to go, or more part of the capital is going to go into lending that capital out, as you can earn a 10% interest rate. However, when opposite, it's going to be opposite. The land is going to be more expensive. And then he compares that between England and France, right? Where the interest rate in England, I suppose, is higher than that in France, and therefore the houses in England is cheaper than that in France, if I'm not too mistaken, or maybe it's opposite. Let's see. So he said France 20 years. Okay, no. This is representative. The market rate of interest is higher in France. Yes. So yeah, it was opposite. the interest rate in France is higher than in England, and therefore the houses or the land in France is cheaper as per se than that of England, right? Okay, so that's the new thoughts. The question that we're gonna ask next time, I think that definitely has to do something to do with capital and the employment of that. And it kind of also has to do something with maybe money and the interest rate. And maybe we can take a lengthier discussion about what we discussed, comparing what does it mean to have negative interest rates. I think we've discussed that previously, but in some other context with money. But maybe what does it mean for the capitalists that the legal rate of interest is negative? Question mark. And I suppose already here I can tell you um, that if we are following, but the legal rate of interest is negative, right? If interest rate is prohibited, as he discussed, right, then we won't lend that much because it's going to be more expensive for us, and we'd want some security on the things that we're lending out. However, that isn't the case where in other markets you can receive an interest in other countries, right? That if I can go to France, I can put my money in there and I can receive 3%. But what if you can't do that, right? So what does it mean for the capitalists that the legal interest rate is negative? Um what does it mean for the capitalist that the legal rate of interest is negative? Well, I suppose a part of the answer is that you will try to employ it elsewhere, geographically. So I'm going to put that as a thought um, employment of capital in foreign countries. Then of course comes how integrated is the capital market and things like that. However, let's see if there's some questions. There are none. Seems that there are none. And therefore, I'd like to thank you for today and thanks for staying with me. It's podcast number 17. Amazing work, I would say to myself. And yeah, I hope that I continue with this. And as per usual, see you next time. But as you know, I don't end like this. There's always a motivation at the end. So today's motivation is guided very much towards me, and I will be a little bit more personal about it, I think. So today was really a bad day. It's a very unproductive day for me. Maybe one of the most unproductive days I've had in quite some time. Maybe the most unproductive day in 2020, actually. Uh, I've done nothing of value beside this podcast, and therefore the motivation goes in this direction. That and I was actually quite unsure whether I would do this podcast today or not. I thought very hard about it, and I just knew that I had to. I couldn't just let it sink. I couldn't let myself sink. And what I kept repeating and what I kept hearing in my mind was dig deep, right? And that is one thing that I usually said to myself while boxing, and sometimes I also tell myself that while I run and it's very difficult for me. It's to keep on continuing working when everything seems very difficult. It's knowing that on the outside you have no energy, you have no motivation, but you just have to keep on going. And I think that also relates to the motivation that I had with Dory one time, where I said, keep on swimming. So that's dig deep, dig deep, dig deep, right? There's something that keeps you going, even though you might have a very bad day. Just now we have a pattern with this podcast. Don't break that pattern, or at least try not to. Um, we are going to have these bad days from time to time. We just gotta dig deep. It's important to not, it's not losing hope, but it's at least not, because hope comes and goes. That's a feeling, right? But don't go down a spiral. So between you and I used to smoke, and today I really thought about buying some cigarettes. Uh, but somehow I dug deep and I didn't. I don't know what it was, but it was the thing that I didn't want to spiral down. So I kind of know myself, and sometimes I know that I have a bad day, and those bad days I just live the bad day then, right? But I don't want to make something that will have a consequence on the other days. I don't want to do something that will ruin the next day, right? So something that have ruined my motivation today should not ruin my motivation tomorrow or the day after that, right? So don't go down a bad spiral. Don't do that. But when times are difficult, just have one thing that you do that is good, where you know that you're pushing yourself into something that you don't want to do. Well, in this day it was the podcast, but I'm quite happy that I did it, right? Because then there's something that I can look at, actually physical, right? I can look at least in the pixels, right? And in the cloud, can look at something and say, today was not total, totally a waste of time. It's not that I ruined everything, right? Ruined parts of the day, but there was something that I did that was good. So don't go down a downward spiral. Just do something and dig deep. Dig deep. Okay, see you next time. And as per usual, I love you all. And here you get the blink. And with the other eye. And now I put my finger up to wait and make sure that you've received the last part of this motivation.